these problems and the challenges that circular economy responds to are so much more important in the MENA region because of the pressures on certain resources that are particularly strong in the region. So on that note, I will start by sharing my screen. Welcome to everyone to this masterclass. It's really about translating what can be a somewhat muddled or a little bit of confusing concept, which is of circular economy. And often the question that you get is, what does it mean in practice? So this is sort of the point of the masterclass, is to look at it from a practical and concrete point of view, and how you can start thinking about it, and more importantly, how you can start asking yourselves the right questions about how to integrate circular economy into your business at whatever stage it's at, whether you're just starting to think about the concept or if you're already going on certain production processes and what you might be able to do and audit in your own processes to be more sustainable. So just a quick recap of some of the things that I hope you will get by the end of this masterclass is that there is a case, and a very strong one, for integrating sustainability in your business. And that involves a very clear change in logic from a linear economy, which is one that is a one track from making to disposing, and obviously starting with extracting, and rather one of circular economy, which I'll go into a little bit more detail in a little bit. Then, of course, I'll go through some case studies and also just those leverage points within your own production processes where you can start to think about either the materials you're using or the processes that you're using or how you're designing your products. And of course, the point that I will continue to hammer home almost on every single slide is the importance of working with partners in order to implement circular economy, because it's just not possible for one company to implement a full circular economy model without engaging partners and the ecosystem around it. And finally, I'll suggest a roadmap of how you can start to think about all the things that have been discussed in more concrete terms, and how you can look at your business in order to implement what was discussed. So going back to the case for integrating sustainability, I think, I mean, it's very clear with the COVID crisis, but even with the more recent crisis in the Suez Canal, that there is a volatility in prices and in supply chains in general, which means that there is an increasing instability in terms of the prices of certain key raw materials, whether that's metals, I mean, of course, fossil fuels, but also food and non-agricultural, non-food agricultural materials. So just to show you this graph very quickly about how that volatility has increased, even just compared to 1995. Of course, you see a spike in 2008 because of the economic crisis, but that has continued to define the way that resource prices are fluctuating at the moment. And so thinking about sustainability allows you to think about how you can add stability to your own supply chain. In addition, circular economy and sustainability are a key part of how you develop your offering and reach new customers with the hopes of growing your revenue. I'll go back a little bit into perhaps the caveats to that specific claim of growing your revenue, but again, I'll come back to that. It's also about capturing value by extending the lifetime of your products. And it also allows you to differentiate from your competitors, increase resource efficiency, for example, in your production. And increasingly, we are seeing that if you're looking for investments in your business, one of the requirements that are asked of are to disclose your sustainability performance. So it really makes sense to start to think and ask yourself these questions in order to make the case for your business that much stronger. So in terms of what circular economy is, essentially it's about capturing inefficiencies in the value chain. So the diagram that you see on your screen right now is just your typical process of, going from a business idea to how you create and design your product, then producing it, distributing in sales, then how your customer uses it, and then what happens at the end of its life, which is effectively disposal in a linear economy. So you'll see that in a linear economy, often there is no real question or conversation about the sustainability of the materials you're using in your production itself. You're also missing out on a bunch of opportunities to engage customers. And there's also, in general, a premature ending to the life of the products you're creating because of the lack of customer engagement and customer education. That means that when you create a product, your customer isn't using it as intensely as it could be used, and they're disposing of it more quickly. And of course, at the end of life, I mean, if we look at like the value chain of textiles, where 99% in some countries goes to waste, clearly that is far from being something where you are using something at the end of its life to recreate something new. So this is where we come into circular economy. This illustration sort of just describes what I was saying, but the point of circular economy is basically to eliminate the waste portion of the value chain. So it's effectively to design out waste at every possible opportunity, and also to keep resources in the ground as much as possible. So that you're basically compressing what you mean by your manufacturing process and the entire life of your product, while removing waste and trying to keep resources, those that are finite, where they are, and using them as effectively as possible if you are using them. So there are two ways to think about how you keep value in your in the circular economy. You either retain your raw materials or your products as biological nutrients, which basically means that anything that you use is able to return back to its natural state. That can be as simple as a t-shirt that's made of pure cotton will eventually come back to being something that is compostable under the right conditions. You also have technical nutrients, which is, for example, if using the same example of fibers, if you're using a kind of nylon fiber, the idea is that you continue to maintain the value of the fiber as long as possible and as close to the maximum value that you had when it was sold to the customer. And of course, if that is not possible, that you maintain it in the system under various different strategies. So just the last two principles behind the circular economy before we get to something very tangible and concrete. The idea is therefore to keep things in the cycle as long as possible, and also to cascade, which means, like I said before, to keep things at their maximum value as long as possible, and then not to return directly to a complete raw material, whether that's technical or biological, but to try and use it in a maybe sub-value product that still has more value than if you had just completely returned it to its raw state. So to really simplify the production process and how you can think about circular economy, I will break down the manufacturing and selling process into three different stages. The inputs you use, the use of the products you create, and what happens after your customer has used that product, and how you can think about circular economy at each of these stages. So if we start with the inputs and production itself, and if you look at sourcing, sort of the foundational principle for circular economy is that you're identifying and using renewable energy, bio-based and less resource-intensive inputs that can be fully recycled. As I said before, that can be technical or biological nutrients when I talk about recycling and returning to nature. So really, when you're sourcing, you have to keep that in mind. Is the point of your sourcing to preserve the technical nutrients or the biological ones? And I'm going to keep emphasizing this point as we go along. So just to bring in our first case study, for example, if you look at the circular series from Napapijri, which is an athletic garment company, the challenge they were trying to address, and that's one that a lot of companies in the apparel industry face, is that when you're creating a product, there are many subcomponents to that product. And traditionally, they're made from many different kinds of materials. So for example, a jacket can have up to 25 different components, from the zippers to the buttons to the fillers to the stitches. There's a lot of different components, and traditionally, like I said, they use different materials, which makes recycling very difficult. That's not to say that there aren't actors who do that recycling, but it makes it less likely that that infrastructure exists uniformly where that product is being disposed of when it's no longer in use. So the solution that Napapijri came up with is that they decided to go with just one material, which is nylon 6. So again, it's not about removing plastic or polyesters entirely from your supply chain, but it's just being more deliberate in the choice of material that you're making, with the objective that, for example, it's easier to recycle and to recover that material. So in order to make that happen, they produce jackets with just the one material. So that's from the filling to the buttons to the zippers. And then to close the loop, once the jackets aren't wearable anymore, they've partnered with another company called Aquafil, which recycles these nylon 6 yarns so that they can then be used again to produce exactly the same jackets. So when we talk about closing the loop, that is a pretty perfect example of that. But again, as I was saying before, the importance of partnerships, because it is unlikely that companies, including Napapiri, have the technology to do the recycling in-house. So they're working with a partner who is the one who has the technology to make this happen, and that is how they've closed the loop. Now, if we look at a different example of sourcing, and again, going back to developing ecosystem partnerships, if you look, for example, at the case study of the Crush range by Upcycled Beauty, they've created a range of exfoliating scrubs from skincare. And what's interesting here is that it's based on plant-based leftovers. So again, it's completely different from the textile industry. It's more around the biological nutrient side of things. And what they've done is they've looked at the waste products and the byproducts of existing agricultural processes and used that as their raw material for certain goods. For example, the pips when you're making fruit pulp, they've used that as an exfoliant. Same with the pits from olives, and also for charcoal powder. Now here, this is an interesting example because again, it really shows how partnerships are important. The way they're sourcing the wood for their charcoal powder is they're working with a company that makes oak fences. So the offcuts from that process are used in the range of this particular company. But this is to say that the sourcing is important. You know, you have to be sure that the company you're sourcing from is also following the same principles of sustainability in their own production process to ensure that there's a transparency and a consistency in your supply chain. So for example, here, they're very clear that the company that makes these oak fences is very diligent about what it does with the oak cuts, its use of chemicals and materials, so that nothing is toxic for skincare, which in this case is particularly important. Then we also have that as part of sourcing and circular economy, you can become a circular supplier. So it's not just about using raw materials and sourcing from other partners, but you can be the one who develops the technologies to provide other companies with the raw materials and the input materials that they might need. So for example, we have Worn Again Technologies, which specializes in the technology of recycling non-reusable textiles. So normally, you know, what I was saying before is there are certain textiles where if you blend, it becomes very difficult to recycle. So for example, cotton poly blends, very difficult. This company has specialized in recovering those fibers. And normally what happens when you're recycling fibers is, why it's difficult to upcycle, is that the fibers get shorter as you're recycling them, which means that their uses are more limited than their original use. But this company, again, has specialized in keeping those fibers as long as possible and reducing the amount of waste from that recycling process. And they now work with big textile companies and provide them with the raw material. So that's just a different angle on how circular economy can become part of your core business. It's, you know, to be that company that supplies others and enables them to be circular in their own processes. So if we now look at product design, the idea behind this is to really think at the very start on how you can make products that are built to last, that are easy to repair, maintain, refurbish, and recycle. So, you know, and also how those decisions make the use of that product by the consumer as efficient as possible. And there, you know, different companies have done this in different ways. In textiles, this is again particularly prominent. If you look, for example, at Nudie Jeans as a company, where part of their value proposition is also that although, for example, a button cannot be recycled in the same way as the textile of their jeans, they want you to reuse the button. So they've created this entire campaign on making the button something that you can remove. It does depend on some customer loyalty, but that it can then be put onto the next jeans. And they also raise awareness of how you can maximize the recyclability of your jeans by the time you are no longer using them. Same with CNA, which is another company that produces clothes. They work very hard to make sure the labels, the threads, and the buttons that they use on certain lines are easier to recycle. And these are very quick examples that you can go ahead and look into a little bit more after this masterclass. So when it comes to product design, the idea is also, it's not just about textiles, of course. If you look, for example, at Frosch, which makes cleaning products, but is considered sort of a gold standard when it comes to the packaging that they use for those products. It's always about bearing in mind what is the most easily recyclable product, and how, even if you have to apply branding, you can bring the product back to that state as easily as possible. So, if we look at this picture, it's between, the clear plastic bottle and the one that has the applied branding and the nozzle and everything. So, for example, Frosch, they will even look at the glue between the label and the bottle to make sure that it is easy enough to take off to promote the recycling of that product. So really, it can go very deep in terms of how you think of designing your product for maximum recyclability. But yeah, I would encourage you to do a deep dive on this, because lots of companies have developed lots of different ways to do this. So when it comes to the manufacturing process, depending on the value chain, the processes can be very different. And I'll later point out some resources, for example, in the textile value chain, on certain processes that have been evaluated and recommendations. So if you look at the machinery and equipment, the idea is to opt for machines that reduce consumption of water and energy. As I said before, in the MENA region, that's particularly important given the strain on resources such as water. The idea is also to reuse the water as long as possible in the production process through various different technologies, including filtration processes. The idea is also to introduce quality control feedback loops. So as quickly as possible, so that when you're creating a product, you know right away if it has a defect, and so that you're increasing the chances that your products are right the first time and right every time after that. So it's really about, at every stage of your process, being observant and looking for the feedback on the quality to minimize the waste that you're creating at the pre-consumer level. When it comes to chemicals and dyes, the gold standard is to source biodegradable and environmentally friendly chemicals and enzymes. Again, I would refer to the Good Fashion Guide here for the textile and garment industry, just because they have broken down the dyes and chemicals into like their larger groups and clusters, and sort of evaluate what you need to keep in mind when it comes to a circular economy approach. But I'll link back to that at the very end. And obviously the idea is also to reduce the number of processing steps just to increase the efficiency of the process. And finally, when it comes to the wastewater treatment, going back to earlier of the efficient use of water, in the event that you are unable to treat the wastewater in a way that it can be reused, to consider where it can go next. So for example, is it possible to sell the wastewater as fuel? That again is something that you will have to audit your ecosystem to see if that service is available and whether it's feasible for your company to include that as part of your process. So final point on the circular inputs in production, and no less important, is really thinking and bringing together all of this in terms of the packaging. So here you really have to be mindful of the most prominent trends when it comes to this field. So for example, for packaging, it's zero or near zero waste, and using recyclable materials as much as possible. Especially because, I think there was research not very long ago that said that something like 60 to 80% of customers will look at the recyclability of the packaging when they're making a decision about that product. So that's not an insignificant thing, and you should really be leveraging that in how you're thinking about packaging. The other thing is you can use bio-based packaging materials. For example, there's been a huge boom in the use of mycelium packaging. This is obviously, soft packaging and not your hard shell packaging. And what has become increasingly prominent in the cosmetics, in the cleaning products, and just liquid product sectors is the idea of designing with refill in mind. So, as you can see in the images on the right, it's about creating a product with a packaging that reflects your brand, but also about creating a product that can refill that packaging, if that makes sense. So, you're creating effectively two things. One that can be reused as long as possible, and the second, allowing them to refill and use that product as long as possible. And finally, just to say that packaging does serve to articulate the transparency of your brand, including on ingredients. And so it really needs to be a very strong part of how you sell your approach to circular economy to the customer. So now if we go to the second stage of circular use, which is when your product reaches the consumer and how they use it. Now, the fact is that sometimes you don't have much control on what the customer does with your product. The idea is rather to extend the life of that product to if you can, or to educate consumers on how they can do that. So for example, what a company might be able to do is provide maintenance services to extend the life of existing products. And we see that with some clothing brands, where as part of what they're offering, and it allows them to charge a premium as well, because they put their money behind the idea that their textiles are durable and long life, is to offer these maintenance services. Then you can also, but this is perhaps more also on the customer side, you can encourage them to share their used goods, their used textiles or their used products to second and third hand markets. And you may decide that that is a part of the market that you as a company want to engage in, whether that's collection or separation and treatment. Then there's also refurbishing and remanufacturing to restore the functionality of goods. The idea here is that upcycling is always a better, is a more circular approach than recycling, which is to retain the value of the product as close to or at exactly the same level as when that product was used by the customer. So again, going to textiles, where you see that 45%, for example, are sold and reused as second wearable clothing. That is very close to its original value. But you also see that 30% of materials are converted into wiping and polishing cloths. So that is converting the materials into something that is of less value and that will keep cascading down to the point where it reaches fiber materials, and those have very little value. So again, it's about empowering customers with better information so that you can inform and educate them on how they can buy and use their products. So just a short case study on one company that is doing this, Patagonia, which is obviously a very large and prominent brand when it comes to athletic wear, is they really put a strong emphasis on the lifetime warranty behind their products. And they're able, like I said before, to charge a premium for that, because they commit to repairing the item or even replacing it if it in some way fails during the use by the customer. But what they've done that goes a step further is that they want to keep the repair and care as close to the user as possible so that you aren't sending back the product to them unless the repairs really are beyond their means. So they've actually spent a lot of time recently teaching consumers how to repair their own products. And you can find it online where, if you want to repair your trousers or your tops or your luggage, they put specific instructions on how you can do that. And that's another way of extending the life of the product. There's also, when it comes to use, a different model, which is that the producer retains ownership of the product that they're creating, and it gives them better control of how they can process it once it's no longer in use, and how it goes back to being a raw material for something else. And oftentimes those models include leasing and pay-per-use, which actually is increasingly common in the textile value chain, for example, where the idea of renting out clothes either through a physical store or online has become it is increasingly mainstreamed in certain countries. Having said that, not everywhere, because it does require quite a lot of logistics. And certainly, if you look at the companies that are doing it currently, it doesn't extend to beyond the national economy that you're operating in. So it's very difficult to implement at a regional or international scale. But the key here is that there are ways of renting and really retaining the control of that product, but it's important to communicate the quality and the hygiene of your product to ensure that people buy into it as long as possible. And again, that really brings in what I'll get back to later, the importance of communication and communicating the work that you are doing as far as trying to be sustainable in your production and design of a product. So if we look at, for example, this company called Houdini, they will rent, you can pick anytime from 1 to 3 weeks where you pick an item of clothing, then they return it, and the washing and the garment care is taken over by the company to be then re-put on their website. Now, if you are selling clothes online already via an e-commerce website and you have a returns policy, this may not be that difficult to implement. However, it does require much more thinking in terms of the logistics of it. So now if we come to the after use, so this is once your customer no longer wears or effectively disposes of the product, how do you recapture the value of that product at the end of its life, so that you aren't relying on a virgin material to recreate the product and to continue selling it? So one of the ways of doing that is to think about how you can recover the item itself through some kind of return system or reverse logistics, and how you can incentivize customers, more importantly, to be part of that system of returns. So one example of this, which I found was very interesting, is this company that creates t-shirts. And not only do they create products that are designed to be fully recyclable, but they also put a QR code on the labels of their products, so that when a customer no longer wants to use a product and would go to dispose it, they can scan the QR code and it generates a free post label, so that the customer can then send the garment back to T-Mill. So that's just one way of where you see the interface between technology and circular economy. And here they're trying to make it as easy as possible for their consumer to return the products. Then if we look at a completely different value chain with Burt's Bees, which tends to create more of the skincare products again, this is a rather complicated logistics model, but the idea is that the packaging is designed to be recovered. So a customer would pay, for example, a $2 deposit. They would then receive a glass bottle with the product that they've ordered, and then they would send back the empty bottle and recover that deposit. Now, this does require working with a recycling logistics partner. In this particular example, they're working with LevelUP, which is a company that also recycles and specifically takes care of delivering and recovering the product in the best possible conditions. So that's just, if we're looking all the way to the most ambitious versions of recovery, then that's probably one of them. And the idea, obviously, as I said before, there are many different places that you as a business can intervene. You can also be the company that transforms waste into raw materials. It is more technology intensive, but it is a revenue stream. So whether you are a company that traditionally does something else and want to add as a revenue stream that particular operation, that is possible, but it just requires quite a strong cooperation between recyclers and producers. So this is definitely one of the transversal themes of this masterclass, which is, if you're going to do the hard work of trying to design and think about circular economy and sustainability throughout your process, you have to communicate that to your customer. And the key value that customers are interested in is transparency when it comes to circular economy and green marketing in general. It's about transparency and how across your value chain you are practicing the principles that you are talking about in how you sell your product. So it's really about giving visibility to your hard work when it comes to sourcing, production, and product design. If we look, for example, at the image, this is taken from Nokia, actually. So it's a completely different value chain again. But the idea is to really express the benefits of implementing sustainability in your product by looking at its operational impact. That can be environmental, the product level impact, and also the societal impact. Often customers are interested in all three of those aspects when they're making decisions based on sustainability criteria. When it comes to reuse and communicating that, it's very important to communicate continued quality and hygiene of the product when the product is recovered and resold, because I think a lot of people can identify with that the concern is about whether when that product is recovered, it retains the same quality, is it clean? So if that is a model that you're going for, it's very important that you emphasize those specific aspects in your communications. Of course, certifications do add credibility, and as part of being transparent, it's probably one of the most effective ways of going by a third-party certification to communicate the principles behind your sustainability strategy. And really, going back to all the things I was saying before, it is important for your customer to be loyal and to buy in to what you're trying to do when it comes to circular economy. For example, it'll incentivize them and make them care about returning products or care about repairing their products. So it is important that you get their buy-in and just work as a unit effectively. So I'm just going to go into 2 different case studies of brands that have focused on communicating their value on the principles of circular economy. So for example, the Nigerian brand NKWO, it works very hard to educate consumers about the waste generated by the textile industry. That is a key part of its communication strategy. And in response to that, they have said they will only create 1 collection a year, which, as you will know, is very at odds with the increasing number of collections that the largest textile companies are producing at the moment. So it's basically countering and rejecting the dominant notions of fast fashion, and that's part of their communication strategy. They also use waste as the raw material for their garments and textiles, and that is also very present in the way that they, in their marketing campaigns. For example, the Web of Things, I thought was a particularly strong version of connecting the textiles to their raw materials. And of course, as part of adding value and a story, like a story is very important to the marketing that you do around circular economy. And so as part of that story, they're also choosing to highlight the strong Nigerian roots to the brand, and how there's a strong connection between circularity and that Nigerian culture. And that is a story that they're weaving around their product. If we look at a completely different brand and how they're choosing to approach the comms aspect of it, we can look at Nudie Jeans. So here, I'm just going to quickly share a different screen of the website so you can see what their approach is. Just give me a second. Okay. Just a quick second and I will pull it right up. All right, so this is a brand that creates jeans, but it is really, it's showing a completely different part of communicating about circularity, which is what I was saying before about the transparency at every stage of production. So if you look, for example, at their sustainability, it's right up there, and they provide all kinds of information about the materials they use, their production processes, the products. And so they're really highlighting as much as possible on sustainability. And that goes beyond the environmental aspect. It's also about the social. So it's really about achieving that triple bottom line, which is social, environmental, and economic considerations. So if we look, for example, at sustainable production, of course, they provide more information on that specific process. But what I want to show you, which I find very interesting, is their production guide. Just a sec. So, you know, if we're taking transparency to the next level, they will tell you, depending on the product, where it is produced. So actually, can someone just quickly confirm that they can see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Perfect, thank you. So you can, as a customer, you can see, depending on the product that you're buying from them, where it has been produced. If, let's say, I go to Knits, I can see who the name of their supplier. I can see, for example, the auditing process behind the suppliers, and what company is the one carrying out the audits. I can see the materials that they're using, and again, here you see you see the names of the suppliers. And so this is really taking it to the next level. But again, if you are doing that as part of your production, why not give value to that and make it part of the way you communicate to your customers? So this is just another really interesting example of how you can communicate the work that you're doing as part of implementing circular economy. Okay, so let me just jump back to my PowerPoint. So the other element of this, and which I've touched upon briefly, is how you can easily combine circular economy with digitalization. The idea being that real-time information and feedback is central to really learning about how to be as efficient as possible with the resources that you're choosing to use. So it can also enable better transparency. For example, in certain industries, the use of an RFID tag is becoming increasingly common. And all that means is that this tag will remain on the product throughout its use, and you can get information about its various stages of production, its transport from that tag. So that enables a better transparency of the supply chain. You can also be more efficient in production through the use of sensors. And again, going back to the idea of really getting things right the first time and getting them right as many times as possible to reduce waste on the floor before your product even gets to the consumer. It also allows you to be more deliberate in how you undertake maintenance on your production equipment. So, you know, any kind of sensor that will tell you how that equipment is doing means that you're making a better decision about when to carry out maintenance. And of course, it also really facilitates the logistics aspect of, and this goes beyond circular economy, really. It's just the benefit of digitalization that works so well with bringing in circular economy. So this image is just sort of, I'm not going to go into every single component on here, but there are different technologies that are appropriate at different parts of production, whether that's extending the life of a product, to giving transparency to the supply chain, or in helping to recover and recycle the product once it's no longer in use by a customer. So really, what do you do with all this information? Hopefully it's been inspiring enough to allow you to start thinking of, what are the small steps that you can take in really starting to think about circular economy. And there is sort of this is just a roadmap of what you might want to think of when you're starting. So the first thing, of course, is to initiate and explore. And that is about mapping what technologies exist, what opportunities exist, understanding the ecosystem and what actors are out there that can really help you at various parts of a production process. Are you able to carry out, for example, and use this technology in-house, or would you outsource? And then the partner becomes very important. The other thing is you also have to analyze and reanalyze your customer base, because if you're a company that is currently with a certain customer base, you have to think about how these changes will affect that. For example, in general, when you're creating a circular product, you do expect that the price of that product will go up because it does integrate the externalities behind the production process that something like fast fashion does not take into account. So you have to ensure that how you're analyzing your customer base means that you don't lose your customers, or that you tailor the journey with them so that you're getting their buy-in as you're implementing your process of transformation. Then, of course, you need to make explicit your current business model. And that means being as honest as possible about what you're doing now and what inefficiencies exist, but also where are the opportunities. If you look back on what I was saying before about, before it gets to the customer, while the customer is using it, and what they do after it's been used. And then, of course, based on that, you would design and develop a circular economy business model, which obviously is based on your current model. It's just taking advantage of the opportunities and really designing out waste as much as possible. Now, the key thing, and if you do a little bit of research on this, you will see that imitation is the name of the game when it comes to getting ideas for circular economy. Most companies will look either in their own industry or even across industries. For example, a lot of companies get inspiration from the packaging industry because there's a lot of innovation going on there at the moment. And the idea is to really look and study those examples and see if there are ways for you to imitate it. Because eventually you will apply through the process of translating that and your own know-how into actual innovation. And of course, cannot say this enough, partnership building within the ecosystem. And then once you've done that at a smaller scale, you explore whether you're able to scale up. So, final remarks. Like I said at the start, few firms can really provide a full circular business model all by themselves. It requires knowing who acts in your network and how they can help you on that journey. It's also, and like I was saying before, the research shows us that there's a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of learning as you go, and the key is rapid feedback loops. So start small scale and then roll out at a larger scale once you see that that's working. And again, key driver is imitation. So just final points. Some of the resources I mentioned earlier. The Good Fashion Guide, if you're working in textiles, is a very good resource. It looks at how you can implement cradle to cradle manufacturing. And like I said, it breaks down the kinds of tech, the fibers, the dyes. It's just a good starting point. Then there are also, like, if you're looking at your own business model, there are lots of tools. I mean, the Circular Economy Playbook was made for Finnish industries, so that the context there is missing a little bit, but they have developed a lot of tools which can help you ask yourself the right questions. So for example, there's a business model development toolkit, a value case tool, technology maturity assessment, and these are all templates that you can sort of run through and see if that helps you along your journey. And on that note, yeah, if you have any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them as best I can. Over to you, Dua.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. We received a couple of questions. Just let me remind you that may you please go to the interpretation section so that if someone speaks in Arabic, you can get the English translation. I personally got a couple of Arabic questions. We'll ask them to you. ولكن قبل ما أسأل أسئلتي اللي هي باللغة العربية حتكون في محمد السلوادي كان عنده سؤال لبياتريس. محمد please unmute واسأل سؤالك. إذا عم تسمعني محمد، إذا لا بنتقل لسؤال تاني. أوكي، يبدو إنه محمد عنده مشكلة بالمايك أو مش سمعنا. لكن بياتريس السؤال الأول اللي وصلنا، هل يتم إدماج سياسات الاقتصاد الدائري بالعالم؟ إذا إيه بأي مطارح؟ وإذا لا ليش لا؟ شو العائق من إنه يصير في عنا سياسات اقتصاد دائري بكل البلدان؟
So if I understand the question correctly, it's if I understand the question correctly, it's is it important to have sort of a coherent circular economy policy globally?
The question is, are there places, countries in the world where the circular economy policies are being implemented? If yes, where? And if no, what are the obstacles? Why no? Why not?
Yeah, I mean, there are in certain countries, there's a lot more work. I think as a general trend, the key is in a lot of countries, the policy is to let the process be driven by the private sector. So it's about creating the conditions for an ecosystem to be created. And that means, for example, ensuring that, I mean, it's very consistent, for example, with the LevelUP project in the sense of looking at an entire value chain and trying to identify the actors to see how that they can best complement each other so that the total product or the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think it depends on the country. Like I said, there are policies in place to really enable that ecosystem formation. The other thing is it's very important to have sort of how do I say this, an information ecosystem as well. And so governments can play a role in that, in making it as easy as possible for companies to be as transparent as possible in their supply chains, and also to make that information available open source or in a way that can be shared with companies that don't necessarily have the capacities to implement these things themselves. So to make those tools available to as many companies as possible. I hope that answers your question.
I think yes, but part of the question is, are there governments that have already started implementing these policies and helping companies and so on? Or it's just like it's still theoretical?
No, like I said, most of the time, if you look at examples now, it's really about making sure that you are enabling innovation and allowing companies themselves to take the risks and to find partners that can help them. So it's really about creating an enabling environment. Then there, of course, as a consumer, there are certain governments that create incentives. I mean, there are some products that make more sense. In textiles, I wouldn't say that that's particularly prominent at the moment, but if you look at, for example, the automobile industry or even in phones, there is a much stronger presence because of the value and the nature of the resources being used.
Yeah, so we're still, maybe what you're saying, or what you're trying to say is that we're still in the nurturing and empowering phase before having everything like go and become real. So the other question is a bit personal, and my friend is asking, what made you personally choose this eco space or like this major to specialize in?
Why? Because it just seems to be a better way. I mean, this is a very personal answer as well. It just seems to be a better way of understanding the complexity that unfortunately a lot of businesses are choosing to ignore. It's not that the complexity isn't there, it's just they're choosing to either obscure it from your consumer. And unfortunately, consumers also need to be educated in a way that they understand that a product that is cheap or that is, very easy to procure, they're not seeing the entire cost of that product when they're buying it. And so, my decision to really pursue, to basically engage in this sector is about giving visibility to the hidden costs, but also the hidden opportunities that exist. And for me, it is really a logical development. As things become more volatile, like I said, even on an economic basis, there are arguments for sustainability. So there aren't no real compromises.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. That's really helpful and empowering at the same time.
Thank you.
Now let's check if Muhammad is with us. Okay, it looks like Muhammad, we lost Muhammad. Hazem, do you have any questions before I go ahead and continue sharing my questions?
لا شكرا دعاء.
اوكي، لكن بقدر احكي باللغه العربيه كرمال الكل يكون عم يسمعني بالعربي واسال اسئله اللي عم توصلني، لان الاسئله عم توصلني باللغه العربيه. اوكي تمام. احد الاسئله اللي وصلتني بياتريس انه مرات في بعض انواع الشركات ما فيها تترك المعامل تبعتها مكشوفه very transparent لدرجه انه يعرفوا شو عم يصير من جوا، لانه حسيت very easy to be copied، كثير سهل انه يكون ينسخوا ويتكرروا وحدا يقلدهم. فكيف فينا نلاقي التوازن ما بين انه نكون transparent بس بنفس الوقت ما نخبر عن الاوبريشنز تبعنا ونكشف اسرار الاوبريشنز تبعنا؟
Yeah, actually, that's an excellent question because, of course, there is a very high cost to implementing innovation, and you want to make sure that you are taking advantage of that innovation and that brain power as long as possible. So when it comes to transparency, there are several different ways in which you can promote the transparency of your supply chain. I think transparency of production is the part where I'm sensing that the question is probably centered. It's really not revealing necessarily the secrets of your production, but I think you can be transparent in the sense of either displaying the certifications. There are certifications about environmental management in production. I believe it's ISO 5001, but I will go and check that and confirm that with you. The other thing is that you can give visibility to the impacts of your processes. and make sure that they are confirmed by a third-party certifier. So for example, if you are managed to implement a production process that radically saves on water, or you have a dyeing process if you're in textiles, that means that you're using a lot less and the slurry at the end of it is much more usable in different forms. I understand that that's not something that you necessarily want to talk about, but the impact of that innovation is worth bringing attention to, because that is also part of what your consumer is looking for and what they'll make their decision off if they're basing their decision on sustainability criteria. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit, but yeah, and I think when it comes to giving visibility to your supply chain, that's just about saying that you are diligent and you are making sure that everyone you work with is following the same principles as you. And I'm not sure that you lose that much from that, but again, you know, that's borne out in practice, and I'd be excited to hear about how that goes for you.
شكرا جزيلا بياتريس على كل الأجوبة اللي جاوبت لنا إياها، صراحة جدا مفيدة، شخصيا كثير استفدت. حأترك بس كذا ثانية، إذا أي حدا عنده سؤال ثاني please unmute yourselves واسألوا. إذا حدا بيحب يبعث لي على الخاص مثل قبل شوي ويشرح لي وأنا أسأل، تمام، ما في أي مشكلة. في سؤال. It's in English. Does the visibility help me in growing? I mean, in my opinion, being honest and clear, people will understand more. And can we consider it as a CA, as a competitive advantage? It's a question from Satanai.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a point that I really wanted to emphasize in my presentation is the visibility is such a key part of growing, because you're putting in a lot of hard work into making sure that you at every stage are practicing the principles of circular economy, and your consumer will be very receptive to that. So it is a real selling point and allows you also to charge a premium. I mean, you know, one person's premium is simply just reflecting the accurate cost in terms of environmental and social impact. But there are customers increasingly, and the same goes for investors, who are increasingly requiring that you disclose and are very diligent in how you bring attention to how you're producing your product. So I completely agree. The visibility, again, you need to understand your market and your consumer, but it will help you grow, and it allows you to communicate the value of your product.